Welcome everybody to our lecture series, Urban Governance and Civic Participation in Words in Stone. I'm pleased to open another lecture today and to announce Miri Rubin, who is a professor of medieval and early modern history at Queen Mary University, London. About her biography, 2-3 sentences. She received her BA and MA from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and her PhD from the University of Cambridge. Miri is interested in social relations within the religious cultures of medieval Europe and has explored these in her books entitled Charity and Community in Medieval Cambridge from 1987 already, followed by Corpus Christi, the Eucharist in late medieval culture, then Gentile Tales, the narrative of sword and late medieval Jews, and many other books written by herself or edited. Most recently, she has published Cities of Strangers, Making Lives in Medieval Europe, just published last year, a book which resulted from the Wiles lectures. What I particularly admire about Miri is that she is not only gives public lectures, but that for certainly 20 years now, she has also spoken on the radio and very often on BBC about historical topics, and thus maintains a dialogue with the wider public.
Thank you.
Today, she will discuss the question, how strange were the strangers of medieval cities? You will see that this term will gather different types of non-citizens. They could range from recent immigrants to, if I translate sentence from Georg Simmel, guests who stay, but whose presence in the city was always marked by difference to the other residents. The micro is yours, Miri.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's so delightful to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. We already practiced this, so it should be absolutely fine. Wow, that's not the first one. That's the first one. So yes, well, it's a total delight to be here. I've been following this series fairly regularly, occasionally had to escape to do various chores and spend my time far less pleasantly than in your company here. I've admired the way in which your series brought together really quite distinguished and seasoned scholars with students, with emergent scholars, and increasingly, I think, a more and more international audience. And it wasn't an audience that sat quietly in the room. Everybody felt welcome enough to ask their questions. That's what I mean to say. So thank you so much, Kati, also for recently sending me the link to all the recordings. So I was able to catch up on the endings and discussions of lectures I wasn't able to attend till the end. And that really, really helped me in structuring what I shall do today, because I thought that coming so very late, as it were, in this wonderful series, a sort of 3/4 of the way through, I could actually just take a pause with you and think, where are we? And draw upon what colleagues have already contributed. So just to remind you that governance, we started early with governance with Caroline Goodson, who really taught us and showed us how early medieval urban governance emerged out of the late empire, what changed, what remained. And we in a way revisited governance also with Beat Kümin, who intriguingly included communities we might not normally consider as urban centers, outside the urban center, as having features that are civic, which should interest us, of course, as well. Now, our first lecture was in fact by Martin Park, who spoke about citizenship, and he gave a real panorama to start with, showing how how citizenship was negotiated, how it was understood in different times. And of course, he in his own studies goes well into the early modern, so he has a really authoritative take on that. And I'll be very much in conversation with that lecture in what follows today. And then we also had the aspect that was introduced first by Fabrizio Nevola and Achim Timmermann, who considered indeed those surfaces and spaces of words and stone of that wonderful title of this series, of color, I should say, as they showed us how townspeople used indeed words and stone in order to make neighborhoods, to construct religious identities, and as ever, religious identities and sectional or neighborhood or party allegiances could, of course, set citizens who have so much in common, town dwellers who have so much in common, also apart. And then this whole issue of belonging and apartness was really beautifully articulated, I think, also by Andreas Lehnertz in his lecture, and he particularly also brought in various types of material culture that were associated with the possibility of Jewish civic participation. And then in the lecture by Vanessa Harding, we heard about occupational associations like guilds and fraternities, where the mundane day-to-day work that almost everybody is engaged in a city, men and women, young and old, were also sites for the development of a sense of a civic participation, but contribution to the civic enterprise through habits that are born within these sections, within guilds or fraternities, lessons in participation, lessons in representation that then also contribute to the greater civic enterprise. So that's sort of up to date with me in terms of the lectures that I attended. And I think it's great to be able to know that all that is available to so many of you who've been also faithful attendants, and also to add and to take some of that forward. So the themes that emerge whenever, well, from those previous lectures and from the enterprise of considering the urban and the civic, is that truly we recognize a series of very similar concerns in urban centers over regions and over periods. And we'll probably find that to be also true as we move on to the end of this series with lectures about parts that are outside Europe. And yet, even as I say that the concerns seem familiar, yet there is always utter specificity in terms of how every urban community has to sort out those concerns and address its questions and problems and challenges, and that specificity depends on sort of the legal pathway that brought that community to where it is at any point, to climate and environment, to the type of work that's being done in it, and of course to demographic change. Again, will be very important. We'll return to this later in this lecture. We also, I think it's true to say, everywhere it is true that there are vying discursive frames within cities. There are the claims and the recommendations, say, of religious thought. There are ideas within traditions of the civic, in our case, traditions, say, of thought about republicanism, or what the res publica is. And the finding a pathway through these influences is in fact part of what civic work is about, and civic participation too. And of course, everywhere the urban confronts the challenge of how do you blend inclusion, the inclusion of talent, of as many taxpayers as possible, as many consumers, while also, of course, protecting privileges of specific groups, privileges of all those living within the city walls, securing the peace and minimizing a risk for the urban enterprises. And just totally to remind you that these cities, many of them, and indeed probably the ones that emerged important earliest, of course, were able to build upon an infrastructure and a pre-existing heritage of urban life from the Roman Empire. And of course, I must remind you, there were, of course, cities in all those spaces that are not marked as well, in Africa, further in the Near East. This is just this particular map looks at the Roman Empire at a particular point, I think in the 2nd century, but still it is pretty impressive to see the communication, the networks, the proximities, where it's denser, where it's less so, because that is a heritage that our people in the centuries, usually called medieval, had to work with. And that urbanness, they had various ideas about what it is to be urban, or urbanity, in that wonderful term that has been very much promoted and explored by the project at Erfurt, of which Susanne Rau is one of the 2 main leaders. So it will always be something about population density, about living close, a lot of people together. It'll also be about what the people make of it. It's about participation, which is important to us, as we'll see. And it's about the laws. It's about the system that evolves, the assemblage that's created in the place, not merely the physical features that make the town or the city. And based on the heritage of law and various aspects of law, ranging from architecture to medicine, lives were made and systems were made in the cities and urban centers of the Middle Ages. And influential writers and thinkers and preachers, devisers of urban systems, had all that material at their disposal. And let's look at some of the ways in which they articulated them. So just starting, of course, with the Isador of Seville in the early 7th. So when he thinks about civitas, yes, it's a multitude of people united by a bond of fellowship, named after its citizens, the cives, that is the inhabitants of the place. So there's a slippage here between citizens and inhabitants. And the urbs is the town itself. The civitas is not rocks, but the inhabitants. It's not the physical, but it's what the people make of it in terms of the civic systems that they erect. And a quote I really, really like, by going many centuries forward into 13th century Florence, into Brunetto Latini, who wrote his sort of encyclopedic history of European civilization, very much based on classical lore, his Livre du Trésor. He wrote it in exile. And his own story of how cities developed is, from that time, they began to build houses and strengthen cities and fortresses and enclose them with walls and ditches. From that time on, they began to establish customs and laws and rights, which were common to all the city dwellers. For that reason, Cicero, and he's channeling Aristotle through Cicero, says that the city is an assembly of people for living in one place and under one law. So there's this issue of the coming together of the, if not consensus, then acceptance of certain types of mode of living together that typifies the city. And in some versions of this Aristotelian vision, other writers will actually say, and living rationally, in a rational way, he says here, under the law. So what does that mean? It means that in the urban communities, which evolved particularly in which of course many existed in the earlier medieval centuries, but which really had a new dynamism to them from the beginning of the 2nd millennium, the challenge is to collaborate, to adhere to laws and customs that are shared and agreed upon, and all that in a fairly close environment where there's actually quite a lot of competition over resources, over fresh air, over clean streets and spaces. So urban projects depended very much on trust. And so many of our speakers in this series used the word trust or spoke about trust. Trust in the office holders, trust in the use of resources which is allocated for everyone to enjoy, like water, and that people will just use it as it's allocated and not transgress. Trust in those who give and take credit, trust in those who give testimony in court, take an oath and will tell the truth, those who create the written records of urban life, hence the real importance of notaries of various descriptions. And of course, even just neighbors, trusting in neighbors to keep an eye on the street for the well-being of all. Who can be trusted then is a question that townspeople ask themselves quite a lot in their discussions of how to choose their representatives, but mightily in when they defined the right to reside and they created pathways towards settlement. And while on the one hand, there was always in the cities a demand for workers and people who will help keep the city safe and for new taxpayers. And all that always vied also with the desire to test the trustworthiness of newcomers. And just to show, to me, I'm always using this example, I think it's just so brilliant, what urban enterprise means. And this is the system by which Siena secured its water system. You all know, of course, Siena is high up and not on a nice river. And so it had to have water transported. And in the early 13th century, we have this evidence, and I say this evidence of this subterranean system of water that brought water literally to every neighborhood and practically to every street, is an enterprise of digging out, just look at that, digging out a subterranean system that wasn't there before the early 13th century. It's even before we have any written sources, we don't even know how it was organized, but just imagine the organizing of labor, the collection of monies towards and then dispersing of it, the keeping to a timetable, and then it results in wonders that are more visible, like the Fonte Branda, this quite extraordinary water supply system, this pool really, just before one climbs up to Siena. It is there not only for the use of dyers and tanners, but also for those who are arriving on pilgrimage or for commerce or for travel to refresh themselves. So to get these sort of things going, you really need a great deal of coordination and trust and urban commitment, everything we would call civic participation in word and in stone. And they believed in Siena. Later on, of course, in this room, the council that ruled the city sat from the mid-13th century in this very room, and it was, of course, decorated in the 14th. You know these images very well if you're at all interested in cities. It was understood that in order to achieve what's on the right, that is to say, a flourishing, safe, hardworking, but well-supplied city, and the flourishing and fruitful contado outside, hinterland outside its walls, which is the wall on the right, you have to have what the wall on the left in this picture shows. You have to have magistrates that bring just the right blend of justice and mercy and temperance in the service of flourishing and peace. That's the ideal, of course. Now, as I say, some of the tests to, as I just said, some of the tests to this urban enterprise were the officials faced them, in particular when they had to decide who is in and who is out, who include and who not. And it's really interesting to see in very recent years, just this great growing interest and also the achievement and completion of various projects that study that very question of the movement of people, of immigration, of problematizing it, like in the book there in the center of Simona Cerruti, and exploring regional or indeed kingdom-wide phenomena, like in the other books here on the screen. And where in the, and as we will see, the question, the word strangers is a difficult one. As you notice on the right, he uses cittadini e forestieri, citizens and strangers, and foreigners and strangers. I mean, even the translation is tricky. Immigrants sort of slightly avoids that. But the whole issue of what are the boundaries of belonging when you stop being a stranger, are some groups never stop being strange in some ways. All of that is what I shall try to help you understand better today. So let us start by remembering that urban centers and themselves had different types of relationship with the authority to decide all these questions. Urban centers lived under different dispensations of autonomy, more or less. They could be almost all sort of self-legislating, as we'll see in a minute, but others are created in royal or princely administrative centers and are much more supervised by those sort of officialdoms. Some were in close to cathedrals and under powerful bishops in episcopal cities. Some developed around monasteries or pilgrimage centers, say like Bury St. Edmunds, or at a convenient crossing or a bridge, in sea and river ports. All of these different types of pathways to urbanness, to urbanity, determine also the structure, the shape of the problem of people coming from elsewhere. Some had, as I already mentioned, vast fabric infrastructure for comfort, for communication, for public meetings, roads, walls, fora, aqueducts, basilicas, public meeting spaces, and so on, which they then, of course, kept and improved, but which was already there structuring the way people live their lives. And all of them, whatever the pathway to this moment, to the moment that they confront the question of who is in and who is out, are always dependent on new people. So it's not something that can be avoided. From workers with little expertise, just working hands, to people with the most exquisite skills in crafts, in law, medicine, finance. And just very quickly, because I've already mentioned quite a few words sort of in as it were, within this assemblage that is people from elsewhere, is that the words that are habitually used in our sources are what I call the four words, that is foreign secus, forensis, forestiere, etc. And then there are extraneos, that gives us stranger. In English, hospitos, which carries within it this idea of being invited or to some extent brought in. Alienus, very popular in English sources. And alongside those, there's also the stage before citizenship, which is incola, habitator, morador in Spanish. So the idea of someone who is habitually there, but not quite fully enfranchised. So the multitude of terms sometimes correlates indeed to the multitude of sort of origins. Where do people come from to the city? So by far the most common and the most sort of the one that produces incomers to the city that have the greatest chance to sort of blend into the city are migrants from the immediate vicinity, from the contado, the hinterland, rural to urban, or small town to greater town, usually male and female workers who end up in households offering various types of service, or in workshops, and some of those in the workshops may well progress at particular moments and be able to join and hope for citizenship, but the majority probably not. Then there's those who have developed over time a sort of relationship with the urban center, maybe as regular suppliers of raw materials, maybe as traders who come, sell, and then go back home. And that can be a prolegomenon to something more permanent. And then there are a sort of more structured plan and strategic relationships initiated by city governors, or indeed by rulers, say, bringing in a podestà in his retinue, inviting a bunch of bankers to set up credit in a city, or indeed the invitation of protected groups under royal patronage. Of course, that's a phenomenon that Kati Sende has written in particularly a lot about for the Hungarian cities, but we also know it from other parts, from Bohemia, from Austria, from Poland. And these are sort of like groups that come from France. So the resulting from this last type of relationship, what results may well be a group of people who have regional or ethnic markers. They might be people who then, having come to the city by invitation, will be noted for speaking a different language or dialect, maybe having a different religion, maybe wearing different type of livery, and sometimes, and we'll return to this, also observing some sort of residential separation, not as a form of exclusion, but as a form of something else that we will have to figure out. So to show the first example, just from a chronicle from Toulouse for the year 1226, many men and women with lords and others, that is unfree and free, others without lords, some with their goods, others without them, greatly improved the city of Toulouse and its suburbs, and the community, which grew and daily received more. So just note there this issue of suburbs. So clearly by the 13th century, Toulouse is a very ancient city, but those who come latest live outside, in this case, in the suburbs, in the newer type of habitations with fewer neighborhoods, with fewer amenities, with cheaper rents, and they live there, well, until when? Maybe there is a next stage for them if things improve for them. But quite frankly, even those suburbs very often came to be surrounded by walls yet again, as it were integrated into the nucleus of the city. So this is the story that brings in large numbers of people from relatively near, and they get integrated into the city. And this particularly well-disposed chronicler claims that greatly improved the city. This is an image. So these are the customs of the city of Agen in southern France from around 1280. And it's a decorated, isn't that glorious? A decorated set of statues. It is simply glorious, and we'll have other images, another image from there. So here I'm just trying to show you what is described indeed in the chapter of the statutes that's just under the image, which is about people who come and bring goods and sell them in the city. They come, they stay, there are limitations on the period of stay, they leave their stuff, they sell their stuff, they go back home. So that is that relationship. That was the second bullet point that I showed just now, that relationship that starts developing. And what's important is that if a person has habitually come and gone as a trader with the city, they may develop, they most likely will develop relationships with local people, relationships of trust, of familiarity, maybe even of business. And that again can be a stepping stone towards entry into the city, as we shall see. So going back for a moment to the authority to regulate newcomers, indeed, if one of those people carrying bags one day decide that they really want to make the leap and join the city permanently, so local statutes were created by communities who had the measure of autonomy that allowed them the jus statuendi. And these are always these sets, I've seen tens and tens and tens of them, and they dealt with the requirements for settlement in some detail. They always deal with the issue of foreigners who want to stay. And they imagine them very much as people who are not exotic in any fashion, but have come from some sort of fairly nearby original location. And in Italy and in southern France and in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, where some cities developed their own statutes, the jurisprudence underlying is Roman law jurisprudence on the whole. But of course, in the cases of invitation of groups to be protected and to labor for the good of the kingdom, as it were, be it the men of Asti who provided credit from 12th century in Paris, or the Jews of Buda, or the Flemings in England, there it is, of course, a matter of interaction with royal administrations and protection and settlement by terms agreed and renewed usually at every time there is a succession by royal charters. So staying in those cities that are self-regulated, because there I think the interests of the ruling elites of the city are most visible. They usually explain themselves more. So they're quite interesting for us. So This power to make their own statutes, of course, covers everything, criminal law, all sorts of regulations of weights and measures, everything and anything to do with city life. But as I say, always also the issue of who comes and who can gain citizenship and so on. And you see here, indeed, this sort of, indeed, the jurisprudence, as it were, that goes into making the statute. So we have that expert in the law on the left, we have some sort of judge or podesta, and we have those notaries taking down very carefully everything. So much so was this enterprise of making statutes at the heart of civic life that by 1309, Siena decided to actually promulgate a vernacular version in Sienese, in Tuscan. And they claim that they do so that poor people and other persons who do not know Latin grammar and others who wish to will be able to see and make a copy for themselves. Of course, we don't imagine that people, poor people went and did just that, but rather it means that using the vernacular extends the social circles of people who are able to read and easily avail themselves of the perhaps artisans, perhaps members of guilds, perhaps traders, and so on. But even so, an effort is made also to proclaim statutes regularly. And because statutes usually, and this is as this particular citation here shows, statutes written above have been read by me, Parisio Betto, notary of Porlezza, which is on Lake Lugano, at the order and command of the Lord Giacomazzo Ferraro Vigevano, podesta the said community of Porlezza in the commune square. Now, I don't imagine that they read out literally. These are some very, very long documents. But what I imagine they did is maybe read out the rubrics, the main proclamation, so that everyone has an idea of the operation of government on these issues and is reassured that not just anyone is allowed into the city, let alone a whole lot of other things. So the process then by which people could move from the status of, bringing wares to market occasionally or to a more permanent presence, this toward what I call towards belonging, involves a combination of work, that is to say, something to contribute in the way of labor. It's bringing your family, it's building a home, and developing some sort of standing of trust in the community, as we shall see. So it is always a process. It's not done in a day. And it is a process where the postulant, the applicant to become from stranger to neighbor is tested in various ways. So we see here again from that beautiful set of statutes from Agen, we see here the image that accompanies as we'll read it in a minute, the instructions about how a person will become a burgess. And here we see these councilmen or representatives of the count, and he is putting his hand on the gospel. As you'll see, an applicant with his hand on the holy gospels will forswear heretics and vaudois and all manner and all errors of heresy. And again, when I said earlier, every city has its own issues and every region has its own preoccupations. So obviously in Agen, which is in southern France, and you know what that means in terms of the struggles, the official struggles against what was considered to be heresy, particularly associated with dualist Catharism. Here, you have to forswear heretics, that you will not take part in all of that on the Bible when you begin the process. This is not something that's very common. Next, there's a sort of period of probation. So you started the process with that oath, but then he will appear before the Lord and his council at their judgment to answer all complaints against him, and that within a year and a month he will buy in Agen a house or land or vineyard, and for that year and a month he must be excused from military service and the watch. Fair enough. It's a period of transition. He isn't benefiting fully from citizenship, so he will not also have the full, have to offer the full services of a citizen. But note this issue of buying a property, having a stake is absolutely crucial, and freeing himself from other lords that he may have had, becoming free in order to be a full citizen, a full functioning citizen. just to show it's a process elsewhere as well, like in 13th century Perugia, the process is 10 years long. So again, as I say, the confrontation with the challenge of stranger into neighbor is one that everyone faces, all cities face, but different cities see the urgency or the process fitting them to be somewhat different. So in Perugia, anyone from our vicinity or district who stays in the city or burg of Perugia with his family for 10 years continuously and does not owe servile homage, see the servile homage again, and against whom there are no complaints during these 10 years, will be free and unrestricted with all his goods. So again, you see 10 years, a pretty long time to feel that you're being scrutinized, that you have to watch your behavior, that you have to watch your business transactions and so on, but all for the good of the privilege of being a citizen of Perugia. In Venice, with its very, very strong sector of oh, I'm sorry about that typo in the second line, a sector of guild manufacture, guild-based manufacture, and the guilds very much send representatives to the councils, is highly integrated in the form of government in the 13th century. So here, in a way, it subcontracted this issue of citizenship award to the guilds, so that, like in the case here of the crystal workers, the cristallai, and if any foreigner comes and wants to work in this craft, he will be obliged to swear to the art, to the craft, and pay 5 soldi, of which a third goes to the Chamber of Justice, that's the Chamber of Justice of the city, and 2/3 to the craft guild. So there's a way in which, if the person is tested by the guild and not found wanting, has the skill and also is able to establish himself in a workshop so that it can operate, that's also sort of economic viability, then the city's quite happy with that, and they even share in the proceeds of the fine of entry. And almost all of these sets also require, sets of statutes also require that the person coming to live in a place should have guarantors even to start the process rolling. And that's why I emphasized earlier on that the having a connection with the city, be it maybe a relative who already lives there, or be it previous business partners, even of a modest kind, can open that door. So they have to give a guarantee, as you see like here, before they can even start the process going. And the home is really, really important. So you see here in 1289 in Fribourg, he must buy himself a house in our city and must make his personal home there with his family and his wife. And if he does not, that house he bought will remain with the city and he will no longer be a burgess. So it's not just an issue of even just buying it. It's not being an absentee. It's actually participating with a family. You'll see in a minute or two that this issue of family is very important. It's some sort of guarantee for soundness, which we may consider perhaps to be dubious, but it was obviously considered by contemporaries to be very important to have a stake, to have a place that you return to. So even just buying and having a nominal residence is not enough. Now, in Siena, there was a real system of scrutiny, which also includes scrutiny of the house. And whereas in the early 13th century, those born to fathers who were Sienese or who got it by petition, which was supported by 2/3 vote, that is, these very strong forms of citizenship, which turned them into either cives antiqui veri et naturales or cives assidui, that is, of continuous presence. We see throughout the later 13th century that this somewhat is loosened. So we can imagine that although the later 13th century is a period of population growth, you would have thought there's much more pressure sort of to keep people out. In fact, it's for Siena a period of tremendous political extension. So in a way, the city needs more officials, more taxpayers for this enterprise where it expanded vastly into the countryside in ways that it had not done. It, of course, lost everything later in the 14th and 15th century to Florence. So they're actually relaxing the threshold for entry from having been in 1295, it was 100 soldi, and then it becomes in 1309, 20 soldi. And having a stake is having a home yet again, and not just any home. It actually is a home whose value is checked very carefully. So we happen to have the remaining sort of set of petitions of a chap called Gerino, Gerino di Sertano of Casole, and he started the process in 1311, and by 1312, everything was approved. But he starts by making a petition to become a citizen, by committing to build the house, to show that he has the land on which to build the house. And ultimately in 1312, the city's builder, assessor, checks the house that it is indeed of the value of 100 lira, and in fact it was more, he said. But this is really interesting, and we'll see later in the late 14th and particularly the 15th century, there are some documents from the Marche further south where, because they're so keen to bring people in because of the population crisis, that they actually give the land. A number of towns in the Marche not only give the land to a newcomer, but also suggest areas of fabric that they can use. They can use stones from the rivers, they can use rushes from the rivers in order to build their homes. So this issue of home is absolutely central, and as we see from Fribourg, it's the home that is populated by a family, not just a home standing idle over there. Now, so this whole process of becoming local presumably also characterized a whole lot of other groups that arrived, and which nonetheless retained certain marks of difference. So those who came from the vicinity of Toulouse and settled probably blended into city life in a quite sort of unremarkable fashion, either as poor workers or as better off workers. But there are groups like the ones that came under particular charters of protection, either by the crown or by a city, who maintained their marks of difference in the long term. So think, for example, Tuscan bankers in Venice, studied so excellently by Reinhard Müller, those with religious difference, like the Jews in Paris, or even a different type of Christianity, like the Armenians of Lviv. But of course, we've learned a lot about the contours of religious difference in Andreas's lecture. Are those of a different ethnicity and language and accent, as was always emphasized about the Flemings in England. So what do we call them? Are they foreigners, even when they've been living for very, very long? I think the word just isn't very helpful, that term. And indeed, it's not used. It's not used. Forestiere, forain is not used for that type of group. So often, and this isn't the case with the Jews or the Flemings, but often those groups of difference do not come in families. They come as groups of merchants or bankers, predominantly male, for long periods and through repeated journeys. So they don't fit that model of the good citizen who will come with a family and become upstanding and respectable. Indeed, Sharon Farmer's recent book about the Lombards, which has a lot about the Lombards in Paris in the 13th century, show that actually these households of men of several generations, often uncles and nephews and so on, who were the Lombards of Paris, were known as sexual predators, were actually troublemakers that appeared a lot in the courts of law, were nonetheless necessary for the function that they fulfilled. But they were there, and they lived in a very particular street. Often they occupied, as I say, a separate but stable neighborhood that is the same place over generations. So they're part of the city, and yet they are marked by difference. Sometimes these groups also developed communal organization, like their own chapels, their own confraternities, their own credit arrangements, their own notaries. And where appropriate, of course, all this was supported by privileges, either by city councils or by a ruling dynasty. So I'm trying to conjure here the sense of the people who arrive and become familiar and which are touched by difference and are not, I'm not even sure if the word integrated is appropriate, but they were embedded in the city, but nonetheless had a multiple set of adherences and identities. Now, such groups can be very, very well embedded in the city, can be familiar, even if they're sometimes misbehave, or if there's sometimes issues with them, like there were with the Lombards in Paris, as I say. But that, despite the embeddedness, and that difference also makes them really vulnerable in periods of strife, of pressure. Again, the background was given by Andreas, but also to remember that tens and tens of communities of Jews took place in 1348 in places they'd been settled for hundreds of years during the outbreak of the Black Death, because a narrative was developed in a period of tremendous anxiety and distress around, that connected their difference, which in their case is religious difference, to the crisis at hand. And however much there was evidence to the contrary, and the Pope presented it in a series of letters, and that this just doesn't stand to reason, the conspiracy stood. In periods of strife and war, the long settled, the third generation, I think they were Tuscan merchants in Avignon, were nonetheless treated violently. They were beaten up, they were treated like dogs, a chronicler says, and their property was taken, and they basically had to leave and escape because of the struggle between the papacy and Florence. The violence against the Flemings in London during the so-called Peasants' Revolt of June 1381 is well known, and there it was absolutely going for a neighborhood and a group, and those were the Flemings, the long settled Flemings of England. And there it's quite interesting again that the perpetrators of the violence were not Londoners, because the so-called Peasants' Revolt was not a movement of Londoners as such, although some Londoners did join. It was men of Kent, men of Essex, men from East Anglia with their specific grievances. So again, is there a way in which people from outside who don't understand the subtle ecology of difference and participation in a city are more liable to commit offenses against the so-called different than perhaps the local citizens who are sort of used to having them around and seeing them around and are in many ways entangled in their lives? And we recently, a number of us in this room, heard a wonderful paper by Shannon McShaffrey, who studied the 1517, the very famous May Day riots in London against a whole array of foreigners. But even there, well, they were called aliens, in fact, and I mean, in the chronicles, they were described as alien, but interestingly, even there was some discrimination, and actually the Italians weren't so much the ones, the fancy merchants were not the ones, but it was much more low, workers, maybe from the Low Countries, mostly from the Low Countries, who worked and in a way formed the competition to hard-pressed working Londoners in a very, very nasty, violent eruption. And just to remind you, as if anyone needs reminding of the contours and the impact of the Black Death, but what we see in the later medieval period is a lot of pressure on that system that I've just delineated, and just to choose, that I delineated in the body of this lecture, the system of accepting, inviting, allowing to settle, trusting, extending trust, even to groups that are marked with difference. So what we see in the later 14th century is various ways in which that sort of those sort of arrangements collapse, are dismantled bit by bit, so that by 1384 in Siena, the Jews who had been there since the 12th century for sure, maybe even earlier, but definitely since the 12th century, the council, who are some wise men, lovers of the faith of Christ and of the honor and of the glorious and most blessed Virgin Mary, have provided that no Jew be able to stay or reside in any house or palace which abuts on the campo of the city of Siena, nor in any house or palace which abuts on the road or street which goes from the Punta San Marco to the Croce al Travaglio, much more easily identified nowadays as a Via di Città, which, if you've been to Siena, you've been to the Via di Città, the big shopping street. So if this is people who are settled and you're moving them about in the city to less ceremonially prominent, to less prestigious, to less, let's say, to places that are less evocative of civic participation. So they moved us 2 streets behind in the first instance. Later, sort of into the 15th century, what we find is a whole lot of the rhetoric that the language of civic participation, of the res comune, of the res publica, that had defined the earlier willingness to incorporate various groups into the city, collapses in the face of, well, I mean, literally the public stage, the public domain is handed over in many places, not just in Italy, to reforming preachers of a very particular type. Bernardi Massiana here is a really good example. And what's really striking about his preaching and the morality that he brought to the cities, and in Tuscany and also further north, literally cities legislated his sermons into urban statutes. It's as if town fathers handed over the voice, the public voice, to people like Bernardino was quite exceptional, but not just he, other type of reforming, mostly, well, Franciscans and Dominicans. Dominicans become much more prominent in the 16th century. So the idea is that the ailing civic enterprise would benefit from a shakeup in the way of a whole sort of rethinking of public life, participation. What is the just price? How do you handle credit? How do you comport yourself sexually? How do you dress? And literally all aspects of life in the city were thus scrutinized, and in his case, literally turned into legislation. So it is in that mood that we find Siena's council moving a step further, and in 1425 issuing this: each and every Jew, both men and women of whatever age they be, those who are, will be, and will come in the future, a big and ample O of the roundness indicated below, and of crocus colored, that is yellow, cloth. Now it is indicated below, because you see there, that's 11 centimeters across. That is the circle, that is the size. Literally, it was drawn on the entry that I just read to you. It was quite something to see. So again, these are local Jews, the setting apart, the adding difference upon difference. And Bernardino's sermon also took the Jews' harm to be a product of their very insertion into civic culture. Tell me if you think that tell me when I finish, if you think I am wrong in this. It occurred to me only very recently when rereading it. So now you'll have to excuse the syntax because it's his syntax, but in the end, with a lot of commas, I hope you'll be able to follow. Spiritual wealth, that is faith and obedience to the ecclesiastical precepts, with other spiritual treasures of true Christians, they do not cease to rape, disparage, consume, devour, and dissipate with poisoned cajolements, refined friendships, toxic gifts, pretended conversations, deceitful thoughts, and acquired freedoms and favors, dragging with them to hell unhappy souls of irrational Christians. This is what the Jews do. And I just really noticed recently, I've read this many times, but what they do then to spiritual wealth and faith and obedience, etc. What they do with the tools that are the tools of civic participation: cajolement, friendship, gift giving, conversation, the sharing of thoughts, the freedoms and favors of an empowered group of settled Jews. All of those they turn against, as it were, the community of Christians. And particularly against those who are drawn to them, who are by definition irrational Christians. So there was a great deal to follow, to discuss here, and quite frankly, I thought to offer to the organizers, we may have a whole series about strangers although we will have to spend a lot of time discussing our terms because strangers are strangely unsatisfactory as a term to describe what we were just discussing. So just some points to take away, because I've come to the end of my 50 minutes, that the common good is a good thing, but it's also a fragile construct, best realized, most easily realized in periods of growth and opportunity. It is able to encompass a great deal of difference, as we have seen. The presence of recent arrivals or of settled communities of difference can foment aggression in difficult times when mobilized by civic actors. And that's really, really important. It doesn't happen on its own. It needs the spokespeople. It needs the people who create the narrative that connects all the dots and connects it, even to people who have been settled for many long years. And the word strangers does not quite capture the blend of belonging and yet having another identity, heritage that so many urban groups in fact did possess. So I think I'll stop here and thank you for your attention. Is all well?
Yeah.
Can everyone see me? Oh, good.
Yeah. First, you will have an applause, Mary.
Oh, will I? Good. Excellent. It's strange. The audience has grown since I started.
Yeah.
How that happens. Immigration into our
room. Yeah. Thank you so much, Miri. First, for wrapping up our lecture series and then integrating yourself with the point of view of the strangers as a special group of urbanites. And then thank you also for this big overview, which leads then also to generalizations that we can attempt. But before we do that, I would ask especially the students to raise their questions now. As always, you can write in the chat or raise your digital hand. Isidor.
Yes, thank you. I apologize for not having my camera on.
I know what you look like.
Oh, thank you.
I've seen you before.
There you go. So you're not missing much.
No.
So I want to thank you. This was very, very analytical. I like that you included the original sources, the original languages. So that was very useful for us and very thought-provoking. My question or comment is basically, I'm thinking as you explain these things about Michael Mann's book, The Dark Side of Democracy.
Yeah.
So again, he's writing about the 19th and 20th century, about nationalism, democracy, and so on. But could you also think about this civic participation and the ideas of inclusion and exclusion through his theory? Because he says basically that this democracy has this dark side, that basically this idea of homogenization, basically that everything has to be like unified and so on. So I'm just wondering if this could be one alley to explore.
I do indeed. I have a sort of, not love-hate exactly, but I mean, Michael Mann is a sort of, I remember when I was a student reading his book on power already. I mean, there's always so much there. And then as an historian, you want to sort of say, okay, so what do I do with this? But no, always thought-provoking. And thank you so much for raising that. So absolutely, that is a very useful framework for us to work with. Because let me tell you that when I started thinking about these issues, I thought I would always, I think I had a discussion with Kati about this. I always thought that the challenge would be that authorities and neighbors, I mean, I also wrote this during the lead up to Brexit. I wrote this during in fact, I literally began working on this in the years of, I say it in the book, in the year the big migration from Syria to Europe, and ultimately mostly to Northern Europe. So it was always about the idea that, you know, the majority is excluding people and they're xenophobic, etc., which of course may well be true. But the more I worked, the more I realized, and that's why I call the book Cities of Strangers, is that the challenge is to recognize that most of the time we are trying to negotiate various forms of difference, not only in ourselves, but also in our neighbors and those around us. And a decent society helps us, gives us the tools to do so, sometimes from concepts that are universalizing, like, say, human rights, and sometimes through the subtleties of toleration and acceptance of difference. And I always assumed, and again, also because I work a lot on Jews and I'm very interested in that it would be an issue of a majority excluding. Whereas what I also, and that of course also happens, but the thing is, what was interesting to me is to discover the desire for difference, the desire to maintain identities, to maintain heritage, even while also choosing to live in a different place, in a society where one is in a minority. And then I got really interested in all these sort of groups, like, you know, why do these Tuscan bankers in Venice of generations, why don't they just become Venetian, sort of thing? And to try and look at it from that point of view. So do you see how it fits into your question? That is to say, to find ways of containing and managing difference, but which clearly these communities found up to a point. But then, of course, there is a sort of residual, or not more than residual, there is always the potentiality that can be built into something that is quite a toxic story, which leads to the sort of exclusions and violence that I've both showed, but also that we know from elsewhere. But I do agree with you, this idea that I mean, it was never, I could think of any society that would meet the criteria of this sort of ideal, sort of equal democracy, as it were. And it's a sort of, what I'm suggesting, I suppose, is that it's a tyranny. It's a tyranny, that it's good that the Tuscan felt safe enough in Venice that he didn't need to become a citizen. There's a rule of law. I'm a Tuscan, I live in Venice, my property is safe, I'm safe. I like being Tuscan. I like to have my networks. It's useful to have my networks. I come and go and whatever. So that tyranny of sameness is really, I think, what he's getting at. And in a way, we, with our good intentions to say, let everybody become citizens, let's include everybody. I mean, like in the medieval community, as it were, because we're projecting onto them to some extent. I spent much more time than I expected thinking about what is it like to be a Fleming in London, you know, and going back home and traveling back and forth a lot. Well, why do I even call it home? One of the homes, because of the wonderful Milan Pajic, who is about to publish a fantastic book. Some of you may know him, about the Flemings in 14th century England, and he shows they're traveling back and forth quite a lot. They sometimes bring future partners, marital partners from there, but they live in London and they stay in London and they to some extent flourish in London, and they go to Flemish pubs in London for that sort of thing that passes in the Low Countries as beer. And so that is exactly what was to be sort of unexpected, that would be the problem. I thought I would be dealing with exclusion most of the time. And there was a certain agency in recognizing that people seek to maintain their identities, to maintain their networks, and also to live safely in a civilized city.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, then the next is Laurent Kiss and then Patrick Morris.
I can't see Lauren.
Yeah, sorry, because I was muted. So thank you very much, and thank you for this very interesting lecture. You have mentioned when you talked about you know, the sources where strangers came from. You've mentioned the relationships initiated officially by city governors and city officials. And well, I'm Hungarian, and in Hungary there were many, well, mostly foreign kings who actually tried to establish their rule by kind of inviting Germans and let's say Dutch citizens from abroad to actually form that kind of urban citizenship that could counterbalance the power of the aristocracy and the powerful aristocrats. And I just wanted to ask how, or what kind of let's say so how these kind of let's say politically invited groups fit into your research, and what have you found, how they could actually move into cities, and how cities actually greeted them?
They became the city to a large extent in terms of the authority that was granted to them, in terms of the laws, which are laws inspired truly by laws that developed way further west in the Holy Roman Empire, and that were allowed for a while to be the way that the cities were run. Of course, we have in the room with us Kati, so Kati Sende, who's written about this so extraordinarily authoritatively. But I would say that part of the narrative is not just the bulwark against the aristocracy. It is also bringing people who have networks of trade and experience and connections in order, with a desire to really build up the urban flourishing. So it's this, I suppose it's an extreme case, but it's not dissimilar to the cities bringing in, you know, bankers from a different part or others. What is more unusual and different is that they are given, in a way, a status of elites. And we have with us Gustav Strenger, who's an expert on Livonia. And the same situation is also there, that under the, you know, in the period after the conquest by the Teutonic Order, of course, these sort of German elites take over the cities, and the lives are relegated to the indigenous people. So these are sort of, I mean, some people call them colonial. We probably need to refine our language there, but it's a sort of situation that you get, say, in Wales, when you get English aristocrats settling in Wales and bringing an officialdom with them, but nonetheless, the workers and the farmers, etc., in the area are all local people. So it's a different phenomenon, I think, and it's only possible under a very strong endorsement by a dynast. It's super interesting because ultimately, by the 15th century, a lot of these distinctions break down. Kati, correct me if I'm wrong. And then positions of privilege that existed before, like certain membership of certain guilds and so on, we see it much, much more mixed. I think that already starts in the late 14th century. But yes, no, you're pointing out exactly. I mean, it fits in as much as we will see. It's different from the story that I told, and that is why I justified in the beginning, or rather not justified, I explained that what was fun about working with the statutes from the cities, that you see a certain type of deliberation at the local level rather than an imposition of a desire from a dynast. So we're getting a bit closer to how communities thought about trust and extending the trust. But it's super interesting, and it's happening in many parts of Europe. So it's definitely a phenomenon that needs that is being explored and has been explored. And Kati, if you want to say something here, you're most welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Laurent.
Kati, do you want to say something?
Well, I can come in briefly, but I don't want to take room from questions to the lecture itself. But I think we see several processes in parallel. One is indeed the groups entering the communities, becoming more integrated into the communities themselves, but also we see a process of, say, certain distinctions becoming more visible or more marked exactly under these signs of pressure or tension, which Miri so much emphasized. So, for instance, the question of language difference, or in a way, forcing the communities which came into the city to use the language of the majority. So such instances will be interesting to pursue further, how these differences become more marked because of the pressure or because of growing tensions in social or economic sense.
And I should, can I just say to Laurent that, and to everybody else, that the use of sort of royal prerogative, as it were, is not just something that happened in Central Europe. So the arrival of thousands of Flemings to Southeast England in the early 14th century under Edward II, it absolutely happened out of choice, out of, he thought that they would be able to really give a sort of empower the community, make it more dynamic with the technologies that they brought with them in textile and so on. And he literally changed the face, the sort of ethnic makeup of whole parts of London and the southeastern cities. So it's not just a story of Central Europe, where it's often the narrative is of a sort of economic lag. It also happens, it's about royal prerogative. I think that's the thing important to remember, which just isn't, or doesn't operate in the same way in some of these autonomous cities in Europe. But I think we're moving on to Patrick Moorish now. Am I correct?
Yeah, hi, thanks very much for the lecture. That was very fascinating. I just wanted to ask about a point you raised towards the end, because you seem to me to describe examples of revolt in the cities in which the townsfolk evince different attitudes to difference to the peasantry. And for example, 1380 in England, I think, was one you raised. Sorry, 1381, yes. And yeah, this seems to show a sort of lack of alignment between townsfolk and peasants in moments of revolt. Now, I've studied a little bit the German Peasants' War, and it seems to me, contrary to the opinion of Tom Scott, in fact, that in that case, it wasn't just peasants, but townsfolk too who joined in the conflict. And I'm wondering if you think it's the case that this sort of alignment between the interests of peasants and townsfolk, which you could say are alliances between strangers, seem to characterize moments of particularly intense revolt. I mean, this might seem like a platitude, but I'd just be interested to see to what extent you think that's a fair generalization.
No question from a student is a platitude. It's EU, and it should be nowhere else. No, but I hear what you're saying. It's not at the core of what I'm discussing here, but what I would put to you is just two things. That peasants and townspeople are not so unfamiliar with each other as we like to think, or as some certain type of 19th century narratives about the making of nations and so on suggest. And first of all, they're familiar with each other in various ways. Definitely in the 16th century, the sort of total integration of people who are working. I would look much more to conflict of interest. I would look more, I mean, dare I say, to what used to be called class, I mean, or which isn't used so readily by historians anymore, but nonetheless, I would say that it's much more, if we want to look at it, we want to look at alliances and competitions. And I think that's something that was also suggested by the paper of Shannon McShaffrey. And I think everything we're doing now in urban history, and I think this very much includes Susanne's work, is the breaking down of the notion that the city ends at the walls. There are so many important networks, migration, and definitely by the 16th century with the economies that actually send out into the countryside industrial work and manufacture work and then collects it back in. I think we would have to have far, far more sort of subtle and economically embedded and specific analyses about agency. That's what I think. But thank you, Patrick, for a challenging question.
So, who else wants to ask a question? We have another 15 minutes. Take your
Everything and
chance,
anything,
please.
folk. I see all sorts of wonderful people on the list of participants. So,
There is one of our speakers here. First, Achim Timmerman, and then
there's
Zoe.
Achim, there's Caroline, there's many, many.
Hi, Miri. Wonderful lecture and happy Thanksgiving from Muncie, Indiana. I was wondering, I mean, you gave us this wonderful examples of these trajectories of inclusion into the city of strangers. I'm just wondering about trajectories of exclusion. I mean, you mentioned Bernardino of Siena at the end and the Jews and so forth, but I'm currently reading all the German chronicles, the Chroniken der deutschen Städte.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, just if you read the Chronicles of Nuremberg, that every month there's somebody who's being branded and banished.
Yep.
And that's a kind of social death.
Yep.
So I just wonder how you kind of, you know, fit that into your kind of narrative.
Yeah, I mean, no, thank you very much, Achim. And it's always lovely to see you. I hope you're not foregoing some extraordinary meal because you're joining us.
It's coming up.
It's coming, okay. I can smell it cooking. No, seriously, Achim. So, yeah, I mean, absolutely. Expulsion becomes a sort of expulsion was always the case. You go back to the Roman Empire, and people were expelled who were deemed either criminal or traitorous and so on. That is not new. And indeed, those very Flemings that were invited into England in the 1310s, they were invited because actually they were expelled by the King of France from their cities for being rebellious citizens. So it works in various ways, but there's definitely a phenomenon of group expulsion that becomes a thing in the later Middle Ages. And we know, of course, of famous cases of expulsions of Jews, but actually we have expulsions of prostitutes, we have expulsions of beggars. Now, who is a prostitute and who is a beggar? How poor do you have to be a beggar? How desperate or how poor a woman do you have to be listed by the town officials as a prostitute? This is a phenomenon that touches lots and lots of people. And it continues, of course, also the expulsions of political enemies. So it becomes, and it goes hand in hand, I would say, with also in-city records one sees, and indeed in the German ones, I don't know if you've come across this, is the increased sort of demarcation, the sort of requirement of oaths, for example, even to citizens, you know, a baker or a butcher in the city, this constant requests for oaths and guarantees, this a constant, both you need people to come in, but the competition is absolutely rife, as between sectors in the economy, some guilds taking over other guilds because of the way the economy is being restructured in the 15th century, and the demand is lower, so the profits are lower. So in each city, it will unfold in a different way, in a different place, but definitely the issue of sort of demarcation, and that goes, I think, in some ways to Isador's question, the question of, can we think in these cities of a common denominator in the 15th century that everybody belongs to and everybody rallies around? And when you read the chronicles, and indeed when you read other urban documents, it looks less so than maybe it did 150 years earlier. And I would just add to that, consider anyone who's gone over an urban rental roll of the 15th century, it's despairing. I mean, it really is. It's vacat, vacat, vacat. The issue of space depopulation is one that is also the breakdown of communities, the breakdown of neighborhoods, that sort of intimacy that I talked about earlier of, you know, women with eyes on the street, neighbors surveilling each other. It looks very, very different in depopulated parts of cities that literally have lost their inhabitants, and of course the tax contribution that is made because of that. So on the one hand, there's a whole anxiety of keeping the enterprise going, keeping people safe by getting rid of dangerous or unwholesome members of the city. But at the same time, there's also inviting in new immigrants, often in a profligate manner, in a way that has very little scrutiny compared to our guy who had to prove the value of his house in the 13th or 14th century. So yeah, that is just some of the ways of, and I'm not surprised that you find those 15th century chronicles to be very turbulent and sort of upsetting in that sense of where is the center, where is the hold, where is the consensus?
Thank you.
And sorry, Achim, just to say that I think that partly the sort of devotional art, the sort of liturgical provisions that are made in the cities, I think, and which you know about, are indeed attempts, as well as the preachers, are all different types of attempts to actually create a sort of cohesion that is deemed to be, most of the time, is deemed to be lacking.
Thank you.
Now, Zoe, please, and for Miri to announce, there is, after Zoe, there is Gabor Klenichai and Caroline Goodson. So we have to economize our time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I'll be very quick. But I have to thank you, Mary, because it was just a wonderful, intermezzo in the middle, but in a kind of very engaging one where you pulled all the threads together and you kind of pushed us on forward. So, to get to the end of the series, so it was absolutely kind of perfectly considered. Now, it's been quite a lot about exclusion, but I wanted to move on a little bit to the beginning of your talk, which was more about this word trust and what I understand to be consensus. And as an art historian, obviously, when I try to teach this, and not just to talk about individual building, but a kind of world around it, I always, as somebody working in Central Europe, end up looking at Italy for sources. And of course, as you did, and of course, Italy is so much richer with this. But I just wanted to ask you, do you think there is something fundamentally different between the kind of examples you were showing in Siena and so on, and what happens in the north, and I'm thinking sense of, the kind of press labor, the strife that occurs around major municipal projects, like the building of big cathedrals in France, when the, population rises against the chapter and the archbishop in Reims, and this happens in Chartres as well. Things are set on fire, people are thrown into rivers, whole towns are excommunicated. So it seems to be actually a big municipal project, although arguably waterworks are more important than a cathedral, but perhaps not, depending how you kind of judge these relative values in the Middle Ages. But it seems to actually produce the breakdown of trust. And of course, you can say why this is. It's high taxation, the burden, and so on. But do you think there is something fundamentally different about this sort of notion of common good in the Middle Ages in Italy and in across the Alps?
I'm going to prefer to say no, because I think we live with and Caroline is in the room, is a massive expert about earlier periods, albeit, but Mediterranean civilization, and there are others in this room, no doubt. But I would prefer to say no, in as much as, for several reasons. For the reasons that Europe is a deeply integrated, super integrated area. You've got your, you've got your merchants from Italy living long lives, many years in the north. They know about it. They come, they learn, they adopt, they adapt. They learn from each other. Similarly, Italians in London and in the Cotswolds. I mean, so first of all, it's the issue of communication of substantial elites, ecclesiastical, mercantile, and so on. Secondly, it's true that ideas about the common good were sort of like probably early established in the writings of Italian writers, but it's absolutely there in the Low Countries, in the cities of the Low Countries. It informs civic art. There's some wonderful articles, particularly by Yann Dumoulin. Oh, I see something in the box, just a second. Oh, that'll keep. I'll write back to David. I just thought it was so the temporality maybe is a little bit different, obviously, in terms of the production of materials based on the sort of Roman heritage. But I honestly think that by the later period, we have to explain forms of turbulence in local communities, in pathways to where we are, in the heritage of political trust or not, which I think is something quite local. And I mean, you may think it's an odd thing to say, given that I tried to develop a sort of model that we can maybe work with in different parts, but that's exactly it. When we work it in different parts, that's when we see there's the whole issue of Iberia. That again, our model of the public good there is really a mix, because on the one hand, you have sort of, you know, with the conquest from the north, more and more sort of Christian implantation, great, deep urban royal involvement in the making of city life. And you have these Christian Jews and Muslims working together, having to live together in ways that nowhere else in Europe is it so very mixed and challenging, and it happens, and they do, somewhere between sort of under royal vigilance, but also local councils sorting it out. So I would say no, but because of the reasons that I just expressed. And that isn't to say that everywhere is like everywhere, not at all. But the potentiality for the same structure of problems to emerge in different parts, I do think overrides our idea of sort of north-south, Mediterranean and not, and so on. That's yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's very helpful to hear.
Was it Gabor?
Yes.
Next? Gabor, my dear friend. Yes.
Thank you very much, Miri, for this wonderful lecture. And first, a comment just for the group expulsion. Something, of course, the poor heretics, the poor Catars should be added. Toulouse having their houses destroyed, being sent to penitential pilgrimage, and if they manage to escape to being burned by the Inquisition. So, but I had another question. There is another distinct group of strangers in medieval big cities, the students.
Students, yeah.
So who are also not only strangers, but having serious conflicts, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, many places. So how do they fit into your scheme?
Well, they fit very well in as much as towns legislate about them, particularly cities that have big universities, you know, legislate about them. And again, we see the pattern. We see in countries where a lot of this sort of micromanagement is offered by royal legislation, like England and France. I really don't know, I'm not sure about, yeah, England and France, where also the universities are relatively early outside of Italy. So there it's, again, like other groups, in a way, other special groups that can contribute to the utility of the realm. As we know, I mean, they control even the price of bread, even the price of the straw that goes into the beds of students in the case of Paris in the 13th century. So yeah, that would be very much, that would fit into this idea in those places where the royal writ runs in the regulation of the sort of demography and the ecology of communities. Then this also did not pass their note. I mean, they were aware and they tried to act, always obviously also in their own interest. And we have a wonderful description of the streets of Paris from around 1300, a poem in vernacular. And it's amazing and how many turns of streets, he goes street by street and describes what you see there. You see, he mentions students. It's absolutely part of, let alone, you know, Jacques de Vitry's amazing descriptions and so on. So it's an economic presence, a very important economic presence. It's also a disruptive presence, like those young Lombard moneylenders. Also students are at that time male and therefore, you know, disruptive and predatory in various ways. No offense to anyone in the room, of course, but it's just, you know, sociologically a thing that has been noted historically. So it fits quite well into the idea. I mean, you may also add in pilgrimage cities like Siena, for example, you have the pilgrims. And some pilgrims come and they stay for a while and then they go. How do you feed them? How do you keep them? So often in regulating institutions, in the case of Siena, of course, the Santa Maria della Scala and the provision there. So it's both wanting them to come, they enrich the city, and wanting them not to stay too long, and also while they're there regulating them. So I think it fits fairly well into this sort of model of a sort of fairly open but also aware and regulating city that sort of develops in that time. Yeah, absolutely, yes. Yes, thank you. There was another person, I think.
Caroline?
Which Caroline Goodson?
Yes, hi.
Oh, hi.
Thank you so much, Mary. I enjoyed this.
You started it all.
Well, in a sense, my question comes back to that, which or comes back to periodization. And so you made a point that for you, the kind of things that you can talk about exclusion, about inclusion, about diverse communities, starts in the turn of the millennium. And I thought, why does she start there? What is it that for you signals the sort of uptick in population at cities? I think you said, I think probably rightly, that things become busier and things heat up in cities after the turn of the millennium. And I think we probably agree on that. But a lot of the things that you identify are things that I think I can find in the 9th century. I can find in the 18th century. So what is it that's the shift? I mean, so many of us think of Lopez and the commercial revolution and what is it that changes?
I think that the reason I can prepare a lecture like this is because of the sources. The sources were created once, of course, there were traders in the 9th century and in some of the cities that actually named. Of course, it goes without saying. And that's because in large parts of Europe, there was just continuity of city life, even if it's somewhat diminished compared to previous periods. But the thing is the legal competence which arises from the swearing and the creating of the commune. And in a way, each one of these cities has a different path. Once it's with the help of a bishop, sometimes it's against the bishop, sometimes you have cities that have two parts altogether, they're just adjacent. One is a commune and one isn't. I mean, so again, that creation, the formation rather, of a sworn, interdependent, and self-reliant perforce community means that they have to figure out how they're going to keep people in or out, how they're going to justify it, how they're going to codify it. And partly they have to put it down, not only because they're doing more, but they're doing it more with more people who weren't there before, sort of thing. So, I mean, it's as if, the statutes are not just because they're useful, but they're also pedagogic in a way. It's like they're reading it in the square. It may well be that people in the 9th century totally knew what you can manage or not. And think of the bishops who are welcoming in large numbers of Jews in the Rhineland and giving them charters and whatnot. But that's a different arrangement from when a city is now has a recently won and a recently gained set of freedoms that then they have to agree, how do we manage this? And I mean, in southern France, of course, it's often under the count, so under counts or under so I mean it's not always the sort of far away emperor and we're doing our thing autonomously. Sometimes the autonomy is won and allowed, as it were, also when there is a potentate of some description existing. So I think it's that. No, I'm totally I must say, this is my last thing, sorry Susanna, but it was so beautiful. I heard a paper about 3 weeks ago about a little town in, I think, what is now the southern Netherlands, and by an archaeologist, and he showed that this port, 13th century port, they've done excavations, and you literally see that the ditches that lead to the port are Roman in origin. And we're talking the southern Netherlands, and the fabric was there. And what have the Romans done for us, sort of thing. I mean, it was just quite extraordinary into the continuity of fabric. So I hear that also at the level of administration, urban law, urban life. But this particular set, the ability to study their deliberations and their decisions about their values and how to apply them, I suppose, with the responsibility of being a sworn group, a conjuratio, a commune, it takes a new step. not because they were different types of people, but their capacities were different and they were answerable in different ways. I suppose that's the answer, but it's a really great question. As we reflect on the flow of our series of lectures. Thank you, Caroline. And I don't know if everyone's aware, but Caroline has just published a new book. Could you put your new book in the chat?
Okay, I'll do that.
Good, good. No, it's exciting.
Yes, sir.
And it's very much responding to our environmental interests of the moment. Yeah. And I hope for more than one moment. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, good occasion. Please do that, Caroline. Yeah, we are running out of time, as you are all aware of. I'm not asking my question, but so I put it as a small, tiny addition, and this concerns the civic participation of these groups of strangers. And what I observed in some cities is especially the rich merchants, if they were not allowed to participate politically, then they are often engaged in charitable enterprises, such as financing the first hospitals or so. And this is perhaps also something important they have done.
But there again, Susanna, that's really important, because the issue of charity, it's very easy to be cynical about it. Oh, they're doing it for show, etc. I'd like to think that the structure of the choices for charitable giving is influenced by what are civic considerations, what you spend it on. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you again, Miri. Thank you thanks to the public for attending. And now we will close this lecture of today, but invite you for the next one. And if you like, then you can hear Sarah Keller, which is my colleague from Erfurt, and myself. We are talking about South Asian cities and the possibilities of urban governance. So see you then, and or another time before Christmas, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.